Hi, everyone. Welcome to the new season of the Theory from the Margins lecture series. I am Patrick Brock, a research fellow at the University of Oslo, and I'll be moderating today's session. This is our second webinar of the year. Please keep an eye on our website and Facebook page for further details about our next guests. Before we move on to introducing today's speaker, I would like to say a few introductory words about who we are and what we do. The Theory from the Margins collective deep reads on current scholarship on post-colonial theory, the decolonial turn, and theory building from the global south. The collective reads works from marginalized communities in the global north and south, as well as critical interventions based on in-depth studies of marginalized groups. Theory from the Margins is primarily interested in the contemporary global academe's engagement with what we understand to be theory, and it aims to spark broader discussions about theoretical concepts outside of academia. I am joined today by my colleague, Dr. Merv Tabor from the University of Utrecht and the University of Oslo, and by research fellow Theang Terom from the Norwegian School of Theology and Society. Without further ado, I now leave the floor to Mervi to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Patrick. So I'd like to say a few words about our guest today, Reighan Gillam. Reighan Gillam holds a BA in anthropology from the University of Virginia and a PhD in anthropology from Cornell University, and currently is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Southern California. Released in 2022 by the University of Illinois Press, her book, titled Visualizing Black Lives, Ownership and Control in Afro-Brazilian Media, carefully weaves in 8 years of fieldwork with an in-depth conceptualization of Black Brazilians' rich history of resistance and cultural activism. In the book, she shows how a new generation of Afro-Brazilian media producers have emerged to challenge a mainstream that frequently excludes them. Reighan Gillam delves into the dynamic alternative media landscape developed by Afro-Brazilians in the 21st century. With works that confront racism and focus on Black characters, these artists and the visual media they create identify, challenge, or break with entrenched racist practices, ideologies, and structures. Gillam looks at a cross-section of media to show the ways Afro-Brazilians assert control over various means of representation to present a complex Black humanity. These images, so at odds with the mainstream, contribute to an anti-racist visual politics fighting to change how Brazilian media depicts Black people while highlighting the importance of media in the movement for Black inclusion. An eye-opening union of analysis and fieldwork, supported by a grant from the University of Illinois Press Fund for Anthropology, the book examines the alternative and activist Black media and the people creating it in today's Brazil. So please join me in welcoming Reighan Gillam. Reighan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Great. So I think everyone can see the screen. So first, I want to just start by thanking you all for having me here. Thank you so much to Patrick Anthony Barbosa Brock for the invitation to present my research here. Thank you, Merv Tabor, for that really generous introduction. And thank you also to the Theory from the Margins group. I really appreciate you creating this space for discussion, and thank you to Theang Terom for your, for your technological coordination and for being here as well. So I'm just going to give a 20-minute presentation about the research and and what I did, and then I'm happy to enter into conversation and discussion about the rest of the project. The research I'm presenting here, I'm going to just start with an overview of the context of the research in which I entered into, some of the methods that I used, and the central concept that brings the book together, which was anti-racist visual politics. So in the book, I'm looking at media produced by Afro-Brazilians, mainly in São Paulo, Brazil, but I have one case from Rio de Janeiro. This is all mainly alternative media. It's not distributed in like mainstream television networks. But the main question that was animating the research was, what representations and images would Afro-Brazilian media workers produce with the relative freedom and autonomy to create their own media? And I'll come back to this. And so I began the research in 2004. And when I started the research, like Black social movements were really making considerable gains. At that point, Black social movements have been in existence in Brazil, since before the 1970s. But at that point, when I came, Lula was president, as he's president now, but he was president then. And he had kind of brought Black social movements into the government, where he had a minister of racial equality. There were different cities. The city of São Paulo had a ministry of racial equality. So Black social movements were kind of making inroads into the larger politics of the city and of the country. And then affirmative action policies were being debated heavily in newspapers and at universities. I was mainly in São Paulo, so the University of São Paulo would host kind of debates about affirmative action policies. And these were policies, they're called quotas in Brazil, but I use the term affirmative action just in English. But these were policies that were meant to increase the numbers of, Black, Brazilian, and other marginalized students in universities in Brazil. And they were just kind of at that point these policies were being proposed, and they were starting to become implemented and voted on in different cities. And so that was creating quite a bit of discussion in the country. And then Law 10.639 was passed in 2003, which mandated the inclusion of Afro-Brazilian and African history and culture in primary school curricula. So this was a time of incredible movement and change around race and Blackness in Brazil. Brazil has sort of thought about itself as a country without clear-cut racial categories, and it had kind of thought about itself as a country without racism, and so that it didn't need these kinds of policies. And so the passage of these policies really kind of ushered in this debate and this thinking about how does racism exist in Brazil? Does it exist? And if so, how? Is Black identity sort of an identity, right? Or are we all mixed race? And what does it mean that we can sort of say Blackness is an identity, right? So all of these kinds of questions were afoot at that point. There were all of these changes in education and in policies, but mainstream media was not showing as much change. So at the time, and I go through this in the book, but largely in mainstream media, you would see this kind of dominance of whiteness in Brazilian telenovelas. And if you did see Black characters, they might occupy maybe more stereotypical or marginal roles. And so on the right here, I have a scene. This is from The Guardian, and they're covering this telenovela Segunda Sol. The cast was majority white, and it was set in Salvador, Bahia, which is known to be a very Black place in Brazil's imagination, but also in the population. And so, but the telenovela was set there, and it was set with a majority white cast. So this is just an example of the kind of, the privileging of whiteness in Brazilian media. And then this telenovela on the left here, this is from the telenovela Duas Caras. It was being shown when I was actually doing the research in 2007. And this is just an example of a maid, of a Black woman being represented as a maid, which is sort of a common stereotype that you would see on television as well. And so you'll see Afro-Brazilians as, usually maids or subordinates. Maybe they'll play like slaves if the telenovela is set in the past. But this is the general landscape of mainstream media when I was doing the research. So I wasn't seeing much movement, I guess, in mainstream media. And so I started to look at media produced by Afro-Brazilians. And also it's very difficult to get into mainstream media as well to do this kind of research. So I started to look at media produced by Afro-Brazilians. This is a team here from, they're in chapter 3. They produced this YouTube show. And so I looked at, like I said, to repeat the question, what representations and images would Afro-Brazilian media workers produce, if they had the relative autonomy and freedom to produce their own media. So I traveled to Brazil over several summers, and I lived there for a year as well, doing the research. I collected this media produced by Afro-Brazilians. Usually it was in the form of like short films, YouTube videos, television shows, and illustrations. I interviewed 31 media producers. I participated and observed when I could the production of the media and any reception that I could find. And then I did like a textual analysis of the media and the films. And this is me on site with this group. They're filming an episode for their YouTube show. So this is just an example of that. Most of the examples come from São Paulo, which is in the southeast of Brazil. But the one case, like I said, from Rio de Janeiro, which was actually just this group. They're in Rio de Janeiro, but it was mainly in São Paulo. And this is a picture I took of São Paulo, and this is a common image of São Paulo. It's said to be like the 4th largest city in the world. It's one of the largest cities in the world. It's huge. About 12 million people. About 32% identify as Black or brown. And then it's a kind of a metropolis of like skyscrapers that emanate out. So it's a very modern city and kind of the center of business and commerce in Brazil. And then I want to just go through and I have here, and so Brazil, if people don't know, it has the largest population of African descent outside of Africa, where about 50% of the population identify as either Black or brown. And so, and again, Brazil is known to have this large Black population, which then again sort of calls into question the media's representation of the dominance of whiteness in the media. So in the book, I use this concept of anti-racist visual politics to try to tie the book together and tie my different examples together. This is how media producers and the visual media they create identify, challenge, or break with racist practices, ideologies, and structures. And so I was just trying to bring together an idea of anti-racism and media production. And I try to break that down in 3 different ways. And one of the ways is that they sort of identify, challenge, and break with racist structures is by just representing racism. And this was a very common thing in a lot of the media that I was looking at, where the media would just kind of depict characters confronting and experiencing racism. And these depictions, they challenge this belief that racism does not exist in Brazil or is less severe in Brazil. And so they're kind of identifying it, and they're saying this is racism, this is what it looks like. And so one of the examples of this in the book is this film Colors and Boots. It's a film by Juliana Vicente, and the film is about, you can find it on YouTube, and it's about this Black girl. Her name is Joanna, here on the right, and the film, she's the main protagonist of the film. She's the main character, and like I said, it's like a 15-minute short film, and she desperately wants to be featured on the Xuxa show as a Paquita. And so Xuxa is here. She was very famous in Brazil. She had this children's television show, and you can see she's like a white blonde woman. She's of German descent, from the German descended population, and scholars have written about her as well as the kind of the epitome of whiteness, kind of showing this dominance of whiteness in Brazilian media, and And on her show, it's not just Shusha, but it's like her Paquitas or her backup dancers, as you can kind of see in the image there, are also all like white blonde young women, and they kind of flank her in the back. They flank Shusha in the back. So Joanna, so the film places this show, the Shusha show, in kind of the world of a Black girl. And we see Joanna wanting to kind of emulate the program and become a backup dancer. But we know that in a way, like she can't, because she's never going to approximate that appearance. And so in the book, I look at 3 films by Black producers. All of them have like children as a focus. And so, and again, this was also very common. I constantly see children in these films by Afro-Brazilians. And I'm looking at like children are kind of associated with these Black political projects to identify how racism operates in Brazil. And I think part of that is because of their vulnerability to racism as children. They don't necessarily know what's going on. And so they, they emulate and go with, what they're seeing. And so in the film, you see Joanna wanting to try out for the Shusha show. And so she tries to dye her, kind of color her hair. She puts this blonde color, yellow color in her hair and ties these ribbons to her hair in order to like give the appearance of trying to like straighten her hair, right? Because her hair is like very full and very curly. And so we see the effects of the film on Joanna. And this is just a still from the film. And you see Joanna down here with the ribbons in her hair. And this is harder to see, but this is a poster of Shusha on her wall. And so the film is trying to make this association, and you see Shusha here. It's trying to make this association between, between the visual world that privileges whiteness and its effects on a Black girl, who cannot, the dominance of these like white aesthetic beauty standards that do not include, all of the population, and particularly Black girls. And so we witness this like struggle, this Joanna struggle to accept herself within these, structures. And in the film, we constantly see Joanna looking, and so the film is like using her gaze to examine and really to depict, but also kind of denounce this visual world that privileges whiteness. So that's just one example again of just how you can see them like just depicting racism and trying to show its effects on like Black people. Another way I think I was trying to link racism to the media is accessing the means of representation. So just by Afro-Brazilians like producing their own media, by like picking up the tools of film and media and saying we want to produce our own programming, they're asserting their right to participate in and have control over the means of representation. And this challenges the low numbers of Afro-Brazilians working in media production or their kind of marginalization from this field. And that was something I constantly heard when I talked to media producers. They would say there's not that many of us, there's not that many of us in this field, right? And so one of the examples of this is Our TV, which was TV de Gente, which was a Black television network that was started in 2005 with the mission to racially diversify mainstream media in Brazil. It was a very short-lived project. It lasted until maybe 2007. But here's the team. The network was founded by Nichinho, who was a television host, musician, and celebrity. And he assembled this team of predominantly Black, but not exclusively Black, producers, directors, actors, like hosts to make the programming and run the network. And so I'm arguing in the book that this was like a site of control and ownership in media. And so they're making this point that in order for us to kind of create the programming that we want, we have to actually create the conditions, meaning we have to take ownership of the means of representation in order to make the programming that we see fit. Another example of this is Juliana Vincenti, who she's a director. She made the film Colors and Boots, which I just talked about. She is a Black woman, and she founded her own media production company, Preta Porti Films, in São Paulo. And she had also worked in mainstream media as well. She also found it to be a place where she couldn't necessarily put forth her vision. And so she founded her own production company and made the film Colors and Boots. She made the film Colors and Boots actually when she was getting her degree in college. That was her thesis film. But then also she's gone on to make a lot of other films, and now she currently has a film on Netflix about Racionais MCs, which are a rap group in Brazil. So she's gone on to make quite like more films. And then the last example I'm talking about is in trying to link anti-racism and Afro-Brazilian media production is by taking control of the media and producing their own programming, they can then ascribe meanings to their own Black identities or to Blackness, right? They can participate in ascribing meanings to Blackness. And so they can endow Black characters, with these meanings. And so if we previously saw how mainstream media sort of associates Blackness with servitude or just erases Black characters in general, this media centers Black characters. They're the protagonists. We get to know their struggles. We see a trajectory of their actions where they can change over time. They're much more complex. Black children tend to be associated maybe with servitude for girls or criminality for boys. In the film Colors and Boots and these other films, Black children kind of represent hope for the future. And in coming to value their own gaze and their own perspective, there's this hope, right, that they will sort of be able to express agency, right, with their own perspective. And then Joanna, like I said, she's the protagonist of the film. She's the central character. And we see her wanting to emulate the television and be on the Xuxa show. And then by the end of the film, she is developing her own vision where she's taking her own photographs. And you can see her in this picture. She has like a Polaroid picture where she's like, again, literally developing her own, what she sees. And she says like photographers don't need boots, meaning she doesn't need to dress like Xuxa and emulate the Paquitas. And then the last example of this is this show. This was a show on the Our TV television network. And there, again, this is one show where they are endowing Afro-Brazilians with this image of like this middle-class professional image. And so this program, they associate Afro-Brazilians with middle-class professions such as doctors, judges, and lawyers. This is a show called An Issue of Rights. And the person who hosted it, his name is Dr. Eggio, and he was like he's a lawyer. He has run for political office. He's a very visual, very public figure in São Paulo around Black politics. And so he hosted the show. And he would interview people on the show. Like they would have guests come on and he would interview them and talk to them about their lives. And when I asked the producer, who did they want to bring on the show, they said, we were concerned to first promote people who would be a reference for the Black community: judges, prosecutors, lawyers, Black scientists, intellectuals, social leaders, politicians. The idea was to give visibility to references, icons, and symbols of the Black Brazilian community. And so this is one example of a producer talking about this show, but this was also something that I found that was very common when I talked to people that worked at Our TV. They were very concerned with bringing on, Black professionals to create this image of like Black uplift and sort of Black professionalism. And so again, I'm arguing that when they produce their own programming, they want to endow Black people with this image of of professionalism and uplift. And many times, again, they were thinking about like the self-esteem of the audience and encouraging the audience to pursue such agendas. And so I'll stop here, but those are some of the ways that some of the programming that I looked at, the points that I was making in the book, and I'm happy to talk more about these different areas. I also in the book talk about humor and irony and satire in one of the chapters. I'm happy to talk about like the founding of the television network, which was used very kind of transnationally from funding from Angola. So, you know, there are a variety of other aspects of this media that I go into in the book, but I just wanted to present it for 20 minutes in this way. So I will stop here.
Well, thank you very much, Reighan, for summarizing your findings. We have some questions lined up, and for the first one, we'll come from Dr. Tabor.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Reighan, for this wonderful talk. So your research shows that despite these many decades of concerted efforts, representation of Afro-Brazilians in the country's media lags considerably legislative achievements. So why did that happen, do you think? And how has the situation evolved since 2013?
I think, do you mean with that the images have not really changed that much? Is that what you? Or...
I think that what I'm asking is that how has these developments in media affected more legislative?
Oh, okay.
And what has changed since 2013?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for the question. I just wanted to clarify it.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of so part of like the strategy for like sort of progressive racial movements has been to target the government and policies. And so they've done that with like education, as I said, with like affirmative action, but then, and they tried with media as well. And so I talk about this in the book where there was this hearing and it was called by, I think Paulo Paim, who was a senator, a Black senator in Brazil. And they had people come and they had like professionals who work in media come and talk about the underrepresentation of Black Brazilians. They had scholars come and talk about their research. They had people like actors came. People talked about this topic from a variety of different perspectives, and the hearing is like it's all documented in a book. So you can read these interviews. And all of this was kind of around a possible law that they were trying to pass that would require like quotas in media. And so that would require like certain numbers of Black actors in commercials and in television programs. And so this basically just didn't pass. And I think part of it is that I think you have like some state-funded TV that will include Black Brazilians, but then the larger media infrastructure is private, and so and Globo is like really like the behemoth, and people say like Globo is currently like losing its share, I think, of the audience, but at that time, I mean, Globo was still like this, and it still is this major dominant force. And so it was basically like if Globo is not going to do it, then they're not going to do it. And I think also the media in Brazil, there's a new book out. It's by Mauro Porto, and he writes about how media is like this mirror of whiteness for the white middle class in Brazil, and how they target like the white middle class as like consumers as well. And so part of it is linked to this idea of who's going to buy these products that are on the commercials, that's funding the programming. And so I think all of this is wrapped up into like economics and who the network imagines to be its audience. And so I think those are some of the reasons that things just were not changing. And then with the changes now, I think there have been actually considerable changes in media, even on Globo, because I think part of it is like Netflix has come in, and that has and other venues as well, and that's like given considerable competition to Globo, so they can no longer fully dominate in this in television and media. And then Netflix is also diversifying its programming, and so I think it's pushing Globo to do the same because people are watching Netflix's programming. And then and like I said too, many of the people who I did research with, like Juliana, the director, like she's got films now on Netflix, and other people do as well. So I think that that is like pushing this, like these changes. But I just recently saw that on Globo they have a new program. I think it's coming out, and I can't remember the title, but it's about this this relationship between this white woman and her black maid. And it kind of, but it also, it breaks the mold. It's not like this kind of stereotype. It actually kind of shows the maid and her own life and her attempts to, I think she's in school and she wants to study. And it shows like this conflict with her, with the woman who employs her. And I think that that's coming soon. So my point is that I think there are changes, and I think the people who wrote that show are also like Black women, that the team that wrote it. So so Globo has been employing more Black producers in the programming, and I think that you're going to see like more changes coming down the pike.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add a little bit about the notion of the commercials sort of reflecting what they expect the buyers to the products to be, because I was living in Mozambique for a while, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and they had a record, you know, the network, right? So they would show soap operas produced by Record, and they mostly featured white actors. But then when you get to the commercial break, you would see the reality of the country, where all the commercials would feature Black actors and be positioned to that. But I see the very interesting point here about mass culture, right? So you're talking about TV, magazines, these large scale media. And my question would be about Afrofuturism, which is kind of a development that comes from mass culture, and it has been growing a lot in Brazil as a kind of a language. Can you talk a little bit about if you're following that, and how do you see the connections with your previous research?
Yeah, yeah, thanks. I think that the film, the director that I talked about, Juliana Vincenti, she has this another series on Netflix called Affronta, and or called Face It, and it's a series where she interviews different cultural producers. They're all, I think, Black cultural producers, and they're kind of sitting on a couch. She interviews them, and she asks them about like how they got into what they do. She asked them about their life, their kind of history, trajectory, and they're all different kinds of cultural producers. They're singers, they're actors, they're graffiti artists. They do all different kinds of things. And one of the things she asks them is like, what Afrofuturism means to them, and they all give a variety of different answers. And I don't necessarily know. I can't recall the answers necessarily, but she tries to weave that into the series. But I haven't. That's one of the only areas I've seen Afrofuturism. I think I've also seen it with a lot of the visual arts. I think they've been engaging with Afrofuturism, and I'm thinking about like there's an artist that's doing a series on the Orisha, and he like he depicts the Orisha like superheroes, and they're all like, you know, they're using their powers as Orisha to like as superheroes to like save like, you know, different aspects of humanity. So I think I'm seeing like Afrofuturism come about in the visual arts in that kind of way, in Brazil. So I think that's where I'm seeing it, but I'm not as fully. I'm sure there's way more out there than what I can say right now. So I'm not like fully knowledgeable about everything going on, but I think it is like this ripe area of like very fertile ground that people are using to like mine the imagination, to think about like visual visual culture.
Because I mean, a lot of this is coming from a long-standing tradition of activism, right? So you talk in your book, you talking about Abdias, about the Black press, and all of the efforts that were won with legislative efforts, so and so. But it's interesting to see this moving more and more toward the culture area, and toward representation.
Yeah, I think that I use the Black movement as a means to think about, like, in a way, like where are the media producers that I'm talking about, like where are they getting these ideas, because they don't just come out of nowhere. And so I think they're coming out of the Black movement and its long-standing like activism that it's been engaged in, really since like probably since Black people came to Brazil, but at least since like the late 1800s and 1900s in São Paulo. And so, and I look at like the Black press in São Paulo and all of these different organizations in São Paulo that were very like these, where they were really trying to like, move for Black rights, like the Frente Negra, which is the Black Brazilian Front. And I think it's interesting because people ask me like why I went to Sao Paulo, and people would ask me also like, why didn't you go to Salvador? And I say, first, really just practically, the TV de Gente television network opened in Sao Paulo, so that's where I went, because that's what I was focused on. But I think that once I got to Sao Paulo, I think in a way like that's where I was supposed to be, because there's actually a lot of, I mean, all the media projects I talk about in the book are in Sao Paulo. So there's a lot of people producing media in Sao Paulo. Not that that's not happening in other places, but then also Sao Paulo has this like very, very deep history of Black activism that I think a lot of people don't really think about, because that's where the Black movement was actually founded, in Sao Paulo. Like that's where the first Black political party was founded in the 1920s in Sao Paulo. And I think that when people say like Black Brazil, people don't think about Sao Paulo. And so I think that part of what I was also trying to, what I do, and I do this in like other things I write, is to think about like Black Sao Paulo in the, and its relationship to this Black activism that you just talked about.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your response. Tian, would you ask the next question, please?
Yeah, Patrick, I mean, before I ask anything, I think there's a question as well, like from the attendees. So I don't know if I should go forward or.
You can ask your question and then we'll address the one from the audience.
Right, okay, yeah. Thank you so much, Reighan, for the wonderful presentation. And yeah, there's like so many things going on, and I was really drawn into some of the stuff regarding identity and representation, because someone like me who comes from the northeastern part of India, and there's always a lot of contestation regarding representations and how like the center or the majoritarians like would want to project the marginal or the minority communities. So I just wanted to know, like, are there varied understanding of Blackness or being Black that you mentioned? And if so, how is it negotiated and represented by the Afro-Brazilian media producers? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, thank you. These questions are really great. Yeah, I think that when I would ask people sort of like why they identify it, like, do they identify as Black? Why do they identify as Black? I should say, like, when I say that I focus on like Black media producers, this is a self-designation. It's not, I didn't come in and say like, you're Black. I would always ask them, usually as part of my interviews, like, do you identify as Black, and why? And most people would say that they had sort of always identified as Black. They would say like their families are Black. They didn't really, it wasn't this, this quandary, like they didn't have to sort of think about it. They were like, oh yeah, I've always been, I've always been Black. So there wasn't too much, questioning about that from an individual basis. And then I think too, there's an idea, I think, of like a kind of a political blackness as well. I think they understand that doesn't mean that like every single person in their family is black or etc., but it means that they, you know, are people of African descent and they identify as such. And that part of what they would also talk about is in coming to identify as black, they started to also that also came with this kind of awakening of like inequality. And so it was usually like they were usually like sandwiched together. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm black. It was like, you know, I'm black. And there was this like moment of awakening where they realized like that they didn't see black people on television, that some of them noticed that they were the only black person in their schools. And they noticed that they would go to certain areas to socialize and they'd be the only black person, and they started to wonder why was that, like why is that. And so there also came this like moment of like questioning, of like noticing the social world and thinking, well, why is it this way? And it's not natural, right? It's not just like, oh, this is the way it is. There's some sort of mechanisms at work here that are keeping some people out of these places where I tend to frequent. So there was all of this. So there was all of this, like usually this like awakening that would go along with identifying as black. And then as far as like differences as well, I think that some people wanted to. It usually came out in ideas of like what people wanted to show. So some people wanted to show, like I said, like middle class black people and these like images of blackness, and some people would say like that's what we're doing is just replicating mainstream television but with black people, and they would say, you know, we're just replicating what you would see on any show and we're just putting a black face on it. That's what some people would say that. So some people were critical of that. Other people would just say, no, we need to show ourselves as middle-class black people because we exist and we know that we're here, right? So there was that too. And then other people would say, you know, we need to come up with our own aesthetic and like our own way of, you know, representing ourselves that reflects something coming out of like black culture and, you know, and our own imagination, right? And so some people were like, you know, were critical of these representations, and they would say, you know, we need to like break out of these structures and like create something new and totally different. And they would sort of critique the media that's already been produced by black people, and they'd say that that's not doing that. We need to move beyond it. So I think that's where those kind of debates would play out around different ideas of blackness. And that's really not necessarily about blackness, but it's about like how to represent it, right? And so again, these were debates. They weren't resolved, but they're just kind of like places where people, you know, sat. Some people really they wanted more innovation. Some people were like, well, it's enough to just make a film, like it's enough to just be able to like to be black and be able to access media, and to make a film is itself a feat, right? And so these were some of the differences that people would express.
Oh, thank you, Tang, for the question, and Reagan for the response. We have a question here from the audience, from Antoine Guiguet, and the question is, do you have any racial statistics about Black people representation and employment in the Brazilian media? Do you include a quantitative approach in your research?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I do. I have some like statistics, and there are tables. So if you look in the bibliography, I have some statistics from a couple places. One of them is it's a group called it's a group called it's Affirmative Action Group in Rio de Janeiro State University, and they have a whole like kind of like a website. They've produced a lot of materials around race and representation in Brazil, and they have tables and visual representations. They have like sat down and they have counted the number of Black people in telenovelas in Brazil from like 2004 until like 2000 and like possibly like 18 or so. They have like a trajectory of work that they've produced. And so they have produced a ton of quantitative work on representations of race and Blackness in Brazil. And I'm trying to find it here, but I can send it to you later. I don't want to take too much time with this, but it's cited. I do cite it in the book, and I use a lot of their numbers. So that's one place where I include those numbers. And then there's a book that, and again, they're in Brazil. There are Brazilians doing this research in Brazil. There's another book that I use. It's called Espelho Infiel. And it's by Flavio Carranza, and he was one of the people who I also interviewed in the book. And he in his book, he has it's by Flavio Carranza and Rosane da Silva Borges, but he has it's about journalism and Black people, and he also has different numbers and figures and statistics about like the numbers of Black journalists, and and I think he breaks it down in different cities. And he was, I think he was the either president or he founded a group of Black journalists in São Paulo as well, like Flavio did. So he's a pretty central person and figure also in like journalism and Blackness in São Paulo. So I do use those kinds of like quantitative numbers to just give an overview of just to kind of back up these findings, right? Because one, it's enough for one to sit and watch television. I used to watch a ton of TV with my host mother in Rio de Janeiro, and I could see that there was this dominance of whiteness in the media. But then I look at these like research collectives who are like systematically collecting this data and distributing it as well to show, to show that this is indeed what's going on.
Thank you very much. Merve, you're next.
So I want to ask about the transnational context of Afro-Brazilian media production. Is there, for example, a dialogue between the representations of Black culture in Brazil and representations of Black culture in the US? And would you say that this dialogue is facilitated by the transnationality of Afro-diasporic culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I would definitely say that there is this like transnational relationship between Afro-Brazilians and African Americans. As I had said before, the television network, TV da Gente, the founder Netinho, he founded it with money from Angola, but he also kind of got the idea for it from the United States, from Black entertainment television, and basically he didn't want to replicate the programming of Black entertainment television, but he just wanted to replicate the idea of having a network owned and run by Black people to produce Black programming in Brazil. So that was where the idea came from. And then I also talk about this too. There was an attempt to replicate a show like one of those judge shows in the United States where they have a judge and a trial. It's like small claims court, and it's usually represented in the United States, and we watch the case play out. There was an idea to do that, but then Dr. Reggio was going to host it. He was going to be the judge, but they couldn't. He said, he was like, we can't do that in Brazil because we can't record the verdict. There's all kinds of stipulations around television and recording court cases. So that he was like, that's just not going to work. So we have to do this other kind of programming, and so they created another kind of programming. But so those were like, it's like you see these transnational relations, but there's always these like bumps in the road where it's not like an exact replication of the program. It's usually like oh, that's a good idea, but we have to do it in a different way. And then the last thing I'll say is that I have this written in another article. It's on this Flow TV website. It's about Everybody Hates Chris, which is a sitcom in the United States by Chris Rock. And that was very popular in Brazil when I was there doing the research. It was running on television. It was running with either subtitled or with voiceovers. It was very popular because it showed a Black family. It was humorous, and it also kind of depicted racism in very humorous ways. But in the United States. And so a lot of the people that I talked to, they would say things like, well, if the United States can have a show like Everybody Hates Chris, like, why can't we, we can have something like that here. So a lot of people I knew watched it. They found it to be funny. And again, it's not that they wanted to just replicate it and say, we can just do that here. But they had the idea of like, the United States was like this site of like possibility, right? Because they noticed in the United States, there is a lot of programming produced by Black people and with Black people in it, and it travels to Brazil. So they see this and they're like, well, if the United States can have this programming, we can have this programming too, because we actually have there are more Black people in Brazil than there are in the United States. So there's no reason why this programming can't exist if it can exist there. And so, so many times people would kind of use it as leverage. They would say, we can have this too, and that's how that kind of transnational relationship would work.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to ask you about culture and these social movements, right? Because I mean, in other places in Latin America, social movements have used culture as kind of a way, a tool, or a weapon. And do you think there's anything specific about Brazilian Blackness compared to other Black populations in Latin America?
I think in Brazil there is, I don't know if there's I think the differences might come in the culture, like with the kind of cultural like manifestations you find there, like things like candomblé and like these like religious aspects, and just like the specificity of like, I think of just Brazilian culture that you find there. But I think like I think in Brazil, I think the specificity, I don't know if it's specificity, but I think it comes from just like the sheer numbers of the population, but then also I think that you do have this like, I think you do actually have like a history of like we talked about before, like contestation in Brazil. But I think that one thing that's different in Brazil than, I don't know if this is different with Latin American countries, but I will say it's different from the United States, is that like Black culture in Brazil has been to a certain extent nationalized in a way. And people have argued this too. It's not just me, like people like Peter Fry and Michael Hanchard and other people have talked about this, but they've talked about how like the Brazilian nation has really kind of like appropriated Black culture in Brazil, and they've held it up as Brazilian culture, which has not happened in the United States, or I think in a lot of other countries. And so like and examples of this is like samba and like feijoada, things like that, even like carnival now. But I think that's like a difference with like the Brazilian like national kind of national ideology and like national identity of itself. I think that's one of the things that are different, and I think that makes it more difficult for Black social movements to advance. It doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it difficult because you have these examples of Black culture in the nation, and so people can kind of point to them and say, well, look, we have samba, we have we have carnival, like and it masks these ideas of that racism exists. Whereas in other countries like the United States, you don't necessarily have this nationalization of Black culture. And so it's, there's like this idea that like there's this like hidden element that doesn't necessarily make it to like define the nation in the United States. So I think that's one of the differences that I see with culture and Blackness.
I was just curious because of the performativity is huge in Brazil, right? You have carnival, and when you're talking about these visual representations, there's an element of performativity as well, right? What is gazed and what is seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, do you mean with like Black culture?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that that as well. And I think that creates like this dynamism, right? There's this like constant, like it's constantly moving, and it's hard to like to pin down, which is not a bad thing. It makes it like dynamic, and it's like constantly in the process of like becoming and you know and moving and creating, which I think is its own like form of like identity and its own there's its own strength to it, but then I think that makes it that hard to like pin down.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Tang, you have the next question.
Yeah, thank you so much once again for this opportunity. And I wouldn't like to take so long. Maybe I'll just ask one very simple question, and it is to do with identity again. And I would like to know, how is identity on and off media being reciprocated or mediated?
How is identity being on and off media being? Can you just repeat that?
Being reciprocated or mediated? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm not. What do you mean by reciprocated? Like through the programming?
Yes, through the programming, and if people actually feel empowered,
Okay.
or if they act the same way. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think that people, I think when they can show the programming, people do like it. It's hard to find an audience for this programming because it's all very alternative, and it's like I said, it's like on YouTube and things like that. But when people, so for example, there was this one show that I talk about that's on YouTube, and it's called Tá Bom Pra Você, or Is That Okay With You? And it was like this humorous, ironic, satirical show where they would just like act out scenes of racism in order to like undermine this idea that racism doesn't exist. And it was hilarious. It was so funny. And people and people would put in the YouTube comments like ha 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 and things like that. So you could see that people found it funny. And then people would also, they would put like comments of support. They would say, thank you so much for showing this for making these programs. Thank you for showing our reality. People would say, see, like they would make fun of the fact that commercials don't include Black people. And so they would say, see, this is the truth in Brazil. See, they don't include us. So people would feel very affirmed by these programs. I thought there would be much more maybe negative comments in the programming, in the comments, but there wasn't. There was a couple comments that would question. They would say like, what's going on here? Is this this looks just like a regular television commercial, for example. And someone would say, this is irony. Like the fact that they're making fun of television commercials that don't include Black people. So there would be those kinds of discussions going on and questioning it. But overall, there was a lot of positivity. And then when I would go to different kind of meetings where people would screen their films, people were they would generate a lot of discussion. People would really kind of like dive into them, and they would really have these very public dialogues about what's going on. And then they were generally very affirming and supportive of the filmmaker and what they were trying to do. And then people would also ask for the films and say, oh, I'm a teacher, I want to show this in my classroom, things like that. So anytime they could actually find people to watch the programming, they would generally, and usually these were like, also I should say, these were like usually like Black people in the audiences too. In the places where I was, where people were like physically. So anytime they could find those spaces, people would be receptive to it. And like I said, and the YouTube was a place where I could sort of get, because they made multiple videos, so that was a place where I could see multiple like different responses to what they made. And like I said, it was overall very positive. People were really kind of hungry for this kind of, I think, material.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our live stream. I just wanted to ask one more question, posing that question to you as an American, because in your book, you talked about the myth of racial democracy in Brazil, how it was sort of a narrative used to build the nation. And now in certain states in the US, especially in Florida, there are laws coming up that kind of want to forbid people from teaching about racism, or what they call critical race theory. Do you see any parallels between that sort of racial democracy myth, or trying to erase these issues, and what's going on in Florida right now?
Yeah, definitely, because it's like, in order to maintain these kinds of like national ideas of the country, which are usually very like harmonious and very romantic, and they revise history to like expunge any like inequality and like violence from the history, to say like, see, we've always gotten along. It's like you have to produce this erasure, and you have to like take out like slavery, right? You have to take out like violence. You have to take out inequality and the way that people have been sort of marginalized or not able to access these opportunities. And so you do that in like any way that you can, I guess, when you're the state, right? And so here we're trying to, like, the certain states are trying to like ban material and say like, no, you can't teach about African American studies, or you can't teach about slavery, which is just amazing, because that there was such a critical foundational aspect of this country's history, and it's not pleasant. Like, it's not this it doesn't make you feel good, I think, but it happened, and it's there. And so so to be able to just like kind of wipe that out, and even the little that people know about it, to try to represent it in such a way that is like palatable, is definitely trying to like maintain these national myths. And I think you can see that here, like there's an attempt to do that, and then you've seen that like in Brazil, where you see like I would talk to people about like slavery in Brazil, for example, and many people had no idea kind of what happened, the severity of it. People just generally did not have a sense of like of what happened during slavery. But now you do see people like going back and revisiting it, and you see like these like slave burial grounds that are coming up when they're building and things like that. And so you do see people trying to go back and revisit it and bring it up. And so I think in both countries, this like kind of, to me, it's a testament to this unresolved. The history is not resolved. It's not resolved in the present. So there's this need to kind of go back and like revisit it. But then you also have like the state, saying, no, let's not revisit it. Let's just let it lie underground. And yeah, so you have these contestations.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Reighan, for your presentation and for answering our questions. Thank you, Murphy and Tian, for participating. This concludes our live stream. It should be online. The whole live stream should be online on our Facebook page for those who just joined, and it will be on our YouTube page shortly. Once again, thank you very much, and see you in the next live stream.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.